Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Yusra Mouzughi, President of the Royal University for Women in Bahrain, previously in Oman with the Muscat University. Professor Yusra, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Sean, thank you very much. It's lovely to see you again, and thank you very much for having me.
Professor, I'd like to just kick off with a slightly bigger picture take on where we're at in terms of academia and the development of the sort of knowledge architecture of the Gulf. We've been for a number of years pursuing a transformation in the region and globally, of which we are participating in, but a transition towards the knowledge economy is central to the success of every economy in the world. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how has the COVID year impacted that? Has it been an accelerator? How would you interpret its impact?
Well, the million-dollar question, I think. Obviously, if anybody had talked about where we're at today in terms of embracing technology in education and, hazarded a guess in terms of what we're doing with utilizing technology in education, nobody would have even, come anywhere near close to what is happening in the education sector generally, not just in higher education, but in the education sector most broadly, in terms of how the shift and, as you say, the acceleration of technology, adopting technology, of online learning methodologies have really become our core distinctive, feature. So universities, as well as schools and most training institutes, have had to almost overnight, literally overnight, transform the way they operate and the way they deliver to a very, very possibly unexpected audience. Nobody was prepared for this. I always say, though, that people say, how are the students dealing with the move to online education? And I say, don't worry about the students. They've all been born with some sort of digital device in their hand. They're very used to this. But it's actually how have the academia as an industry, how have we dealt with this as
the academics, those
academics,
who are
exactly, and the administrators, in terms of the professional support staff. How have we, because we have not been born, we're not citizens of the digital world, we're immigrants into this digital world.
Absolutely, yeah.
And therefore, it has been a very, very steep learning curve. People have been put outside possibly of their comfort zones. If you've been teaching in a particular way for the last 20 years and suddenly overnight, people are talking about breakout rooms and Google Analytics and whatever, then there's a completely different...
Well, you wonder in a way, Professor, if one equates technology deployment in the academic sector with a acceleration towards a knowledge economy. I mean, it's not necessarily 1 and 1 isn't 2 in this equation.
It's not, but 1 definitely leads to 2, in my view. As you know, I mean, the basics of one of the fundamental pillars of a knowledge economy is education and training, and that the OECD talks about that. Many different researchers talk about the role that education plays in developing a solid knowledge economy. Now, how has that been accelerated or propelled in a COVID era? I think there are benefits and some challenges, let's say. I think the myriad of opportunities to engage, to collaborate, to access knowledge and information very, very easily has really opened up the doors for real innovation, real development. However, we are still learning how to use this, particularly in this part of the world. This is very new to us. So there's still a level of caution on what can be trusted, what methodologies are reliable, what collaborative opportunities to pursue. sometimes it seems a little bit like there's a little bit of shooting in the dark and see which one happens to bear fruit. So in my view, one of the fundamental requirements for this part of the world, and I'm careful when I say the Middle East, because I think the Middle East is a very, very, and I'm sure you know this better than I do, Sean. It's a very,
but for our audience, it's worth clarifying.
You're looking at a much broader range of countries, economic status, if you like, and economic abilities, as well as educational attainment levels that are very different across this part of the world. And therefore, if we're looking at the GCC, for example, you have very established economies, you have strong ICT infrastructure, you have, political stability, you have a lot of those fundamentals to allow you to focus on developing the knowledge economy. If you look a little bit broader and you look at some of the other countries in this region, ICT infrastructure is less developed. There's still a lot of political turbulence, possibly. There is educational attainment levels are not as high. There's a lot of brain drain. A lot of the expertise is moving to other parts of the world. So the challenges are very different in my view. And I think I would caution not to, put an umbrella term on the knowledge economy.
If we focus on the Gulf and from the point of view of, for many years in terms of our the move towards a knowledge economy, it's always felt like we've been sort of playing catch up, that just to get to where others were years ago were having to sprint just to catch up. I'm wondering, does this period in which this sort of everybody's compelled into an online environment, does it kind of, as Tom Friedman, the famous New York Times opinion editorial writer, has said in his book, The World is Flat, that in this kind of sense that the world is flat, does it give us here in the Gulf an opportunity to catch up, or at least to maybe accelerate that catch up?
I fully agree, actually. I think it's not a level playing field as such, but COVID has brought everybody back to a particular standing point of, okay, what are our priorities? How can we get everybody on the same page, if you like? Now, in terms of the Gulf in particular, there's some main advantages in that there are relatively smaller populations. So the youth of those countries can be a real asset, because that's where the innovation takes place. That's where the embracing of technology is most likely to happen. The entrepreneurial drive, etc., it tends to be more related to that. Now, obviously, on the flip side of that is you've got very young populations in some of these countries, and they're still in the education system. They're going through the education system and are not at the other end. Having said that, and if you look at the strategic plans, the 15, 20-year strategy documents of pretty much, I would say, all of the countries of the GCC, education plays an important, vital role in all of them. So education has become a key driver, and it's recognized as the key to developing into knowledge economies for all of these countries. And there's a real commitment and investment in education. And that, I think, brings those countries up, the countries in the GCC, up to a level where they can compete. Now, we have to be careful, I caveat that we're not competing on all levels. We can compete on specific areas of focus rather than trying to compete with the mega economies of the United States and China and whatever.
But in terms of delivering the kind of the foot soldiers, but ultimately the engineers, the knowledge value for these economies, that they come. I mean, we have, and you and I are both imports into this region, but that the actual knowledge economy can come from the ground. You're leading now a university for women in Bahrain. Women are really now perhaps the gateway to the catch up for the Gulf in terms of reaching those goals of the knowledge economy.
Very much so, Sean. I think we all, I think it's fair to say that the voice of women had been silenced to a great extent previously, particularly in the Industrial Revolution and in the following years in terms of the actual value contribution of women, not just the presence on the industrial landscape, but in terms of the value contribution that women made. Now, I think with the new main commodity being knowledge, the new kind of the knowledge economy, the service economy, the reliance on cutting edge knowledge and technology, women have an opportunity and have proven themselves, I think, have an opportunity to really make that valuable contribution, that contribution that will lift economies to a different level of existence, of provision for their people. I mean, all you need to do is look at a university like ours, Royal University for Women, and look at the opportunities it creates for women in Bahrain and in the region, actually, with quite specific disciplines that are catered to that particular aim. So it's very much about creating opportunities, harnessing those opportunities. But I do go back to the idea of focus. And I think it's very, very important that we establish clusters of excellence, if you like, if you wish to call them that, or areas of focus. And I know,
like what, for example,
would be the
focus of your academic institution?
So, for example, here in the university, we have just launched a research center for women's studies, which really focuses on, as you can imagine, the contribution, the challenges women face in the region, but also how we can overcome those and create opportunities for women to be effective in a different way. I know that I've been talking to colleagues here in Bahrain who have very recently been launched Sheikh Nasser Center for AI, artificial intelligence, for research and development in AI. Now, that's also a really interesting and up and coming area in this part of the world. It feeds into the energy markets, it feeds into our main commodity, obviously oil, how AI can help with really making that production of oil and the more efficient, if you like. Similarly, I've been talking to, or actually this morning I was attending a webinar held by Diraset, Center for Diraset here up the road, actually, looking at food security and adopting technology for food security. There are many areas that I think are, what I like about it, Sean, is the fact that it addresses the local challenges. Whereas I think previously, many of the studies or research attempts were very much based on Western-centric problems or challenges being superimposed on a local or regional setting.
I remember coming across a statistic a number of years ago in Qatar. I mean, it was not unique to there, but it was what it came from there. And that was that 70% of the students in engineering were women, and they were the best performers in the class, but only 1% were ending up in the field of operations. I mean, when you think about that from the scale of knowledge or the absence of it being deployed after it had been successfully educated, is that gap closing?
Unfortunately, my experience in Oman indicates otherwise, because we have very similar situation with wonderful, wonderful young female engineers. And the statistics were that, and people working in logistics, young women, studying logistics, but the statistics were not reflected in terms of actually taking up employment afterwards. But this is where I think the opportunity comes in as those disciplines and areas of work move to become less, boots on the ground, if you like.
Yes, remote, artificial intelligence, automation,
and that's where
all of these digital tools.
Exactly, and I think that's where the contribution you will really be able to see the benefit of this, silent workforce that has been educated well, trained well, but has not necessarily had all the opportunities to contribute to driving forward towards the knowledge economy. And you can see
the digital toolbox that is now emerging can facilitate the cultural sensitivities for a woman engineer to go in the field at an oil rig. Now they can work in the studio, if you like, in terms of the choreography of all of those solutions, but doesn't have to be exposed to the environment.
Absolutely, very much so. And I was recently reading up about it in terms of, you know, the hard infrastructure vis-a-vis the soft infrastructure for many of these institutions, you know. And yes, you will need the hard infrastructure of the oil rigs and you know, the presence on the field and you know, in, you know, remote places in the sea and whatever, but actually the soft infrastructure, the digital understanding, the artificial intelligence, the ability to program, to code, to analyze, to pick up trends, to you know, predict, all of those things don't need to be done on the field, in the field. They can be done, you know, and actually possibly even from home. You know, now we've learned post-COVID.
Or even from, you know, very far away, in a sense of whether it be an oil field in remote Abu Dhabi from, you know, from the center of the city. Just to pull the lens back a little bit, Professor, another thing that has occurred over the course of COVID, it would appear to a certain extent, certain countries in the region have introduced austerity measures in terms of, let's say, in Saudi Arabia, VAT was tripled overnight. Other things we've seen is labor reforms, the sort of cutbacks in compens to discourage people going into the public sector, and also we've seen, to a certain extent, an advancement of the nationalization of industries that previously were very much expat led. My question is to focus a little bit in around that subject. Are we ready in the region to take up the reins of the higher skill sets, the sort of high knowledge skill sets, where nationalization can, we've seen it very successfully done over many decades in Saudi Arabia, but less so in other countries?
I think that's a very good question, Sean. And I think if anything, COVID has provided exactly that opportunity for governments, who I believe have been very, very brave actually in making some quick decisions, some, I wouldn't say instant decisions, but very well considered decisions that have required a level of rigor and bravery to implement, because these are not easy things to put into force. I mean, obviously, previously I was in Oman and now I'm in Bahrain. And in my view, both countries have very, very ample abilities in terms of a workforce that can take the country, both countries, to the next level in terms of leadership at the highest level. You've got to bear in mind that these countries have had 30, 40 years of a lot of investment, if you like, of knowledge from expat
Yes.
workers. And by nature of, you know, the work that has been done, I mean, you've got to remember my background is knowledge management and knowledge sharing. There has been a lot of both explicit and implicit sharing of knowledge. And I think it is probably time, a little bit like we did in education, a little bit, you know, kicking and screaming, moving into the digital world. I think now is the time for that kind of national capabilities to take over, to assume the power and to drive it to the next level. And I think, you know, the investments in education that have happened over the last 3 or 4 decades, bearing in mind a lot of these young leaders have been educated in the West, they've had the highest levels of, you know, support in terms of securing excellent education, they've got the background, they've got the training, and now, you know, being provided with that platform to grow is and demonstrate that leadership is right, you know.
I mean, I think in some ways the government or the policymakers have been waiting and waiting for industry to make that knowledge transfer, that knowledge transition to the national workforce, that higher skilled national workforce. And you'd say the international partners have been sluggish to do so, and maybe they're going to have to move a little quicker than they have in the past.
Exactly. I would say so. I think there's, the benefits are obvious, but now is the time to really invest. And I would say, not regulate, but I would say ensure that this is built into all agreements and contracts in terms of, with the investors, to ensure that this is part and parcel of all projects. The investment in the national human capital, the investment in ensuring that not only are they trained, but they are given the responsibility and the authority, the accountability as well as the authority to make those decisions to drive forward. I think it's, there was that previous period was a necessary period of preparation, creating that fertile ground, and also allowing the bright sparks, the leaders to shine, so that you can identify the leaders going forward. But I think it's very much needed at the moment. Bahrain, for example, is a very small country, so it's really, really important.
But being a center of knowledge for literally millennia. I mean, I think one of the earliest universities in the world was in Bahrain.
Very much so. And also in terms of the region, it has the first school in this region, and the first school for girls as well. So that investment over a whole century, 1919, I believe, was the first school in Bahrain. It's a whole century of education has now really come to the fore. The fruits of that have really come to the fore. And honestly, you look around, I've only been here a couple of months, but obviously I've been watching what's happening in Bahrain for a while. And you look around and you look at the capabilities, and you look at where the country is a center of knowledge, but also recognized globally as a financial center as well.
Yes, yeah. I used to formerly work with Bloomberg many years ago, and our first center of operations in the region was in Bahrain, and that I believe that facility is still there. Just to wrap up, Professor, clearly, a lot of the things we just talked about, we've sort of taken a local, regional sense, but this has been a global experience the last year, and the acceleration of digital and the acceleration of technology adoption is happening all over the world. So no matter how fast we think we were running here, we're going to have to run even faster, because everywhere else has accelerated their digital adoption. I'm just thinking from your perspective, looking forward, coming out, hopefully, of this COVID sort of smothering posture of the last while. What's at stake, given the world has changed so dramatically as well?
Sean, I've been thinking a lot, not only from a kind of a university perspective, but from a kind of a personal contribution perspective. What do we need to do different post-COVID, I think is what you're saying, And for me, as universities as well.
We can pat ourselves on the back that we've done well, but meanwhile, so have many others.
Yes, exactly. I think for me, for this part of the world at least, and for us in education in particular, there are a number of critical factors that we really need to consider very seriously. Though we may officially be in competition, we're going to gain more by collaborating than we are by competing. I know that for a fact, right? So looking for opportunities to collaborate meaningfully, looking at our strengths and not looking so far afield to collaborate. We don't necessarily need to collaborate with people who are, so far away. There are strengths closer to home and in the region. And I think for me, this is a real area that has not been leveraged as much as it could have been and probably should have been. So
particularly with the advancement of women, I would say that's an agenda very much at the forefront in many of the countries.
Absolutely. I mean, here in Bahrain, we're blessed to have the Supreme Council for Women, and that can very much play a leading role in driving forward the agenda for the region, in terms of how we can meaningfully translate that into actions, into real, with clear ROIs, if you like, and clear measurable impacts on our economies. So there's that kind of area around collaboration and cooperation rather than competition. So the 2 C's versus the 1 C, if you like. The other big area, I think, for the region is around investment in research. Historically, traditionally, investment in research has been limited in this part of the world, and that ultimately has impacted the standing of, though actually...
Well, also because there's been limited PhD programs, right? So it's hard to do research without PhD being anchored at the academic institutions.
Correct. Now, if you think back traditionally, the role of universities has been very much about teaching and research. So we take hopefully young, bright talent and teach them so that they can be wonderful citizens and employees. And the faculty do research within institutions and hopefully drive those institutions forward. More recently, there's been a push and there's been a third stream added to our portfolio of work, which is the kind of transfer or interpretation of that research, the commercialization of that research,
right.
So that it's innovation, so that
applied.
Applied. So it means something for businesses. And actually there is a dollar sign or a dinar sign or a pound sign or whatever next to that. And that takes a different skill set. That takes a different, you can have the most wonderful researcher, but they have no idea on how to, commercialize and move that, transfer that. Hence, and you will recall, we've been talking about bridging the gap between academia and industry, and how do we do that, and the challenges. That is also another real area of growth, because if you look at it, the number of institutions, higher education institutions, has really, really grown exponentially in this part of the world, particularly if you compare it with the size of population.
Yes.
So what is the added benefit? What is the added value that these institutions can possibly make to our economies? And I do think that there is a real opportunity to grow that in terms of, transfer of knowledge, transfer of innovation, and transfer of knowledge into industry.
That has to be a part of the next. I mean, we went into COVID with a lot of those questions sort of already present. We can't really afford to come out of it and miss the opportunity to really, the collaboration piece, the applied research piece, these are absolutely critical to stay engaged in the global economy. And again, not to be left behind given the speed that others have gone into. But Professor, we could continue to chat. There's no doubt we have lots to catch up on, having not had the chance to talk in a while, but we'll have to leave it for another day. I'd like to thank Professor Yusra Mouzughi, President of the Royal University for Women in Bahrain, for joining us today, and wish you all the best in your next academic year.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you for having me, and all the best to you and all colleagues at Gulf Intelligence. Much appreciated.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully after the summer.
Soon, inshallah.